Hey everybody, welcome to Tim's Final Confessions. I'm Tim Derling and returning to chat about a new book. Mr. Martin Popoff, good morning, sir.
Yes, morning. Good to chat with you again.
We are here to talk about Martin's latest album by album book, Innocence is No Excuse, Thin Lizzy on record. And I know
Honesty
this
is no
is,
excuse. You
oh,
said innocence.
who's, that's Saxon, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, funny.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Honesty is no excuse. Thin Lizzy album by album, a book which, to be quite honest, I'm surprised you hadn't done sooner. I know Thin Lizzy's a longtime favorite band of yours, but I know that you had some reservations about doing this because you've done so many Thin Lizzy books, and you wondered what there was to that you could glean from this. So, what finally made you decide to do a Thin Lizzy album by album book?
Yeah, so it's true. I had originally done a trilogy to cover the entire story, and then that got condensed down to two books, and one of those even got reissued. So it's pretty complicated. But the current Thin Lizzy story books that I have are Emerald that take us up to 76. It's kind of a cutoff there. So Emerald, and then there's one called The Sun Goes Down. So those two are my, the standard tell the story paragraph by paragraph, blah blah blah. And then we did the Thin Lizzy, a visual biography, which I thought, okay, what can I add here? So we did the very detailed timeline there, and then many pictures. It's a coffee table book, hardcover, that's still available. So yeah, all that was kind of left to do in the ticking off the boxes, and I was surprised that I would enjoy doing this much. But I've also done this with Blue Oyster Cult, where I had previous books and we did a panel book. The cool thing about this was that now I'm going to a panel of experts, which you gladly were part of it as well. You're all over this book here too. So the idea was, and I'd done many of these before with Voyager Press, and now with Weimer, we've got the Robert Plant, of course, as well. And but what I really liked about this was it's now going to other people for their views on what's going on with this catalog. And I thought, oh man, can I, shoot me now, can I listen to a whole bunch of people talking about Thin Lizzy? And it turned out to be completely enjoyable because there were so many interesting concepts and ideas and connections made between songs musically and lyrically that I hadn't thought of before. And it was really cool to have that deep dish discussion of all the studio albums. And that's essentially what this book is. It's a Q&A where I'm the moderator. And what I also found interesting about it is that someone would bring something up, and then it would spark me to add to it, and then quickly we'd be building and building, and the concept would get stronger. And then I figured, okay, my voice has got to be in here too. So there's a lot of my opinionating in the questions as we go along here. So it turned out to be, and very much like the Blue Oyster Cult one, which was the other one that was the first one that started this challenge of, wow, can I possibly learn more or talk more about Blue Oyster Cult? And that one, called Dominance and Submission, turned out to be completely fun as well. So yeah, that's what I got out of this. So I think we added a lot to Thin Lizzy scholarship by gathering whatever it was, 10, 12 people to go over this catalog again and teach me a bunch of new things about the band that I had no idea, that I didn't think, well, that's a cool philosophical way to look at what Phil was saying in
Yeah.
this case, sort of thing. So yeah, it was definitely a satisfying project.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be involved in this, and I'm still honestly very much a newbie when it comes to the Thin Lizzy catalog. I haven't heard all the albums, but so I'm in Shades of Blue, Orphanage, Fighting, and Thunder and Lightning, and I do know those albums quite
Jailbreak
well.
too, I believe.
I think it's just
Are you
I
part
don't
of the
think so.
Jailbreak?
I
Oh,
think it's just Fighting and Thunder and Lightning
okay.
and Shades of Blue, Orphanage. What a what a tongue twister of an album title that is, that second album.
Yeah.
Um, that yeah, and it's Thin Lizzy is a band that I had heard about for many, many years before I actually started exploring their catalog, because just about every band I ever liked, especially from the 80s, always swore up and down Thin Lizzy, yeah, Thin Lizzy, Thin Lizzy this, Thin Lizzy that. Yeah, they were great. And or if they're a 70s band like, Rush or Aerosmith, they toured with Thin Lizzy, and they always had, well, maybe not Aerosmith, but Rush always had great things to say about the guys. And I certainly knew at least a beginner's guide, about what they were all about, and some of the personnel that were in there. But I really didn't know the catalog until just a few years ago when I started to dive in. And my it's an interesting is an overused word, but it's such a strange band because it's their catalog is so varied and yet not varied. I mean, you can, with Phil behind the mic, you pretty much can pick out that it's Thin Lizzy, but it's truly, like, to me, it's truly amazing that they, number one, they lasted as long as they did, but they did manage to carve out a career mostly in the UK. But a lot of their albums are not particularly commercial. Great stuff on them, but yeah, it's one of those bands. It's like, thank goodness that the music industry was such as it was, because it took them a long time to hit any kind of stride of getting through to the masses or whatever. And sadly, in on this side of the pond, they really only did it once, with Jailbreak, but that's such highly respected players and albums. And it was really fun to dig into those particular albums and hear bits of where bands pick some things up from. You hear a lot of that listening to Thin Lizzy, and you go, oh, that's where that came from, or that reminds me of this. So Thin Lizzy is a band that they started way back in '71. But when did you get on board with Thin Lizzy?
I'm pretty sure it's hard to remember, but I definitely I would think well, no, Johnny the Fox is a new release. I definitely remember that. Jailbreak, maybe not as a new release. The funny thing with Thin Lizzy, I seem to remember as a very young kid, like between say 9 and 13 years old sort of thing, thinking that I was really turned off by the name. It sounded like an old 60s hokey blues band. Without kind of even thinking about it or knowing, I'm thinking, is this a female singer blues artist kind of thing, right? So I remember for the longest time, I'm like I say, I'm 69, I was 6 years old, but let's say 7, 8, maybe 9, 10, 11, 12, thinking just in the back of my mind as I'm starting to have a few bands in my life like Black Sabbath, BTO, Nazareth, I do have this vague memory of thinking that's probably not a band I'm going to like because of that stupid name, right?
Yeah.
Either a blues band or, like I say, a female artist or whatever. But I do remember it feels like my earliest memories, oddly enough, are all the way up to like 12, 13 years old, maybe Fighting, but Jailbreak. I remember one of the early albums I had as well was I remember getting the Canadian compilation, The Rocker, and getting a bunch of old stuff as well. But I absolutely remember anticipating and being excited about getting Johnny the Fox as a new release. I think that's the only clear memory. So I obviously knew about them by late 76. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned that I thought was a really good point. Varied, but not varied. It's true. Like you look at this catalog, and if you pick out any single album, you go, this is chaos, right? But as soon as you start having all of them in a row, you can almost, and this would be an interesting exercise in itself, although subtly throughout this book, you get all these connections made, but you could actually probably take all their songs and clump them together into piles over time and realize Thin Lizzy is these 7 or 8 things essentially throughout the career, which is a lot. seven or eight things is a lot, but when it's seven or eight things on each album and you only have one or two albums, yes, you are completely disoriented. But getting the entire album, in totality, um, you're starting to feel that organizing principle going on, and the great unifier of all this, of course, is Phil. So you get a certain world that he created. You get his distinct vocals. He's the bass player as well. He's involved in the music writing. So it's funny. It almost comes down to the greatest amount of variety in Thin Lizzy is the first two albums demarcated to themselves as being quite old sounding and quite acoustic and folky. And even when they're heavy, it's pretty raw and simple and power trio-ish and not a lot of power. So you get the first two albums, and then everything there moving forward, even Vagabonds, even Nightlife, really. From there all the way forward to the second to last album, Renegade, are of a set where you're feeling this essentially this complex world that Thin Lizzy created, and then finally you get Thunder and Lightning, which is again an anomaly, just like the first two albums are an anomaly. And this time the anomaly is that it's very heavy and distorted and kind of one-dimensional in terms of the arrangement. It's just a piercing, howling, heavy metal sort of sound. So yeah, everything in the middle adds up to this complex world of many parts. But when those parts are somewhat consistently the same parts, album to album to album to album, you do start to calm down and feel like you've got a band that you can understand.
Yeah, it's like, I know what you mean. Like if it was a band that put two records out in the early 70s and then went away, you'd look back on them and like, boy, they had potential, but they could never.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, every album, it's got the lament, or it's got it's got the designated heavy track, or it's got a song about getting out of town, or or it's got a song about like some version of a star-crossed lovers, a story like that. Yeah. It's true. They do have, as opposed to being a one-trick pony, they're like an 8 or 9 trick pony, and they did it pretty consistently. And you're absolutely right about Thunder and Lightning. That stands way off by itself. As I'm not sure there's albums you could compare it to. I know that long ago you've always talked about this concept of be careful what you wish for, because when you always wish Thin Lizzy were heavier, they got heavier one time. And I like the album going back and listening to it, but it's not the album. What does Thin Lizzy sound? I'd be like, look, if you want to hear a good early 80s heavy rock album, go get Thunder Lightning, especially if you're a John Sykes fan. If you want to hear what Thin Lizzy sounds like, I would never start them off with Thunder and Lightning, because everything after that would sound weak because it's not recorded as heavy. It's not as, noisy. But yeah, you're right. They do have these distinctive periods. And one of the things that I always knew about Thin Lizzy from reading about them was the celebrated, the twin lead guitars and all of the guitar players that passed through. And all of that is true, but really Phil was the glue that held it all together from what it was 71 to 83. I mean, they were pretty prolific in all those years. Do you think that, there are points in a band's career where you can really look at and go, well, if they were going to make it, it would have been there? Do you think not being able to successfully tour, jailbreak in North America really kept them from breaking completely through? Or was their music so, the way it was, I wouldn't say obscure, but do you think they were just a band that was just never destined to be a big, big, big band, but rather just kind of like a well-respected band that could sell out mid-sized places and sell X amount of copies every time? Do you think it would have made a difference if they'd have been able to tour over here more often?
Yeah, it's interesting. So they had the essentially the two, well, three really, if you think about it. So they had the hand injury to Brian Robertson when he was defending Frankie Miller in a bar brawl and cut up his hand. We had Phil getting hepatitis on the road, which is a similar story to what happened to Brian May. And then later on, the drugs kind of took over, and I think heroin hampered them from essentially, Black Rose through to Renegade and whatnot. It was still prevalent in the band. So that, every time heroin's a funny story with these rock bands, because you always detect a slowing down of the band, or they go away for a while, sort of thing. And Thin Lizzy eventually, it's almost like they self-defeated, then self-medicated. And it almost felt like, okay, we know we can't make it in the States, and we're giving up the ghost. We're giving up really thinking we can make it in the States. You also wonder, it's an interesting story how there's really no racism anywhere towards Phil. I mean, it's amusing, the story of Phil in Ireland, where essentially his story is that people thought he was amazing. People loved the idea of this Black Irishman leading this band, kind of thing. And he says he basically didn't experience any racism. But you wonder, and you never really hear that, really to do anything with whether they made it or not in the States, kind of thing. But you kind of wonder if he's kind of the and that there's a slight racist undercurrent to the idea that he's not your typical front man of a band, to make it in the 70s in America. That it is just kind of weird that there's this, he's got the afro and all that sort of thing, right? He's a Black Irishman frontman who's also playing bass. So he's got his hands full, so he can't be the proper frontman that way. You just wonder if there's a couple of strikes against him there, and one of those strikes is a subtle, and like I say, there was never really any overt racism about Phil, but you wonder if there was a little bit of that as well. And then also, there is this thing we talked about, that possibly they were just going over people's heads a little bit. There was almost too much to what they were doing. And then also, this is something you and I have talked about many times, with respect to bands, say in the hair metal era, not moving to California to be part of the industry. This is a band that was nobody relocated to the States at all, anywhere in the States. So it was just, they were coming in, and for the reasons we spoke about, it was sporadically, but nobody relocated to the States. And they were this sort of half Irish, half English sort of band. Oddly, when you think about it, they didn't really have roots anywhere. They didn't really have headquarters, to a certain respect. I suppose they were mostly an Irish band, I suppose. But you wonder if that hampered it as well, that they're not particularly playing the game to its fullest, to break in America. And then also, you think of them being on Vertigo, Mercury, and whatnot, and possibly it just not being the greatest operating label to be on in the 70s. And yeah, just and just essentially not playing the industry game to its fullest, where look, you really want to break the States, you got to spend all your time here, you should probably record your albums here, all that kind of stuff, right? That would have helped them in the States. So yeah, it's hard to say. It does seem like there would be a strong single per album or whatever, but possibly there's a little bit of the idea that, to have a kind of no real big single on Johnny the Fox, but so to have something like Dancing in the Moonlight as the follow-up to Boys Are Back in Town and Jailbreak a Cowboy Song doesn't really fly, because it's not a very heavy song, and there's not much else on there. So yeah, maybe there weren't clear singles going forward as well, and and just they happen to get lucky with Boys Are Back in Town. It was essentially single stuff, but even that, it's kind of a heavy song, kind of a long song. It's got jammy bits. Even that song kind of goes over, could have potentially gone over people's heads. It's not an obvious single, but it happened to be a single because there's just so much charm in what Phil's doing, right?
Yeah. I wonder if some of it too was, Phil as a vocalist, that, because he wasn't a strict singer and he tended to, throw a lot of syllables in, within the bars to get them. And a lot of it was almost not rapping, but a lot of it was almost spoken. And he sang behind the beat a lot. Like I wonder if people were like, oh, I don't know about that. It's interesting you mentioned the record company, because I was surprised to find this out, that starting with I think it was starting with Live and Dangerous, not in Canada, but in the US, they were on Warner Brothers for the remainder of their career.
Right. Yeah.
But yet, who was managing Thin Lizzy? Who did they have managing them?
Boy, I can't remember how that story goes because it changes a couple times over the years. And it didn't feel like management was particularly strong either. That's the thing. They almost felt it almost felt somewhat chaotic. The way, something you said that what something you brought right. Phil is a singer. That is interesting what you bring up about Phil as a singer, because yeah, I remember this being a little bit of a revelation in talking to all you guys for the Blue Oyster Cult book as well. And then I think I even did a podcast episode on this idea. But singers that are unconventional for not pushing a lot of air. And so Phil is not you made a lot of great points about the a lot of syllables, singing behind the beat, but also the lyrics are a little complex. And then you're right. This idea of not being the type of exuberant, energetic, high singing frontman. He's not that either. So add that to the pile of things about Phil as a frontman that don't jive particularly with the idea of a super commercial frontman. So I like that. But again, that's kind of an interesting parallel to Blue Oyster Cult, where neither Eric or Donald, kind of Joe Bouchard actually pushes a lot of air when he sings too, but Albert doesn't. So Phil is like a laid back sort of singer, and it's funny. Another guy like that, Pete and I are going to be doing a Sea of Tranquility, where we're mushing together the catalogs. We've done this three episodes in a row, and it's been kind of a hit. But we're going to mush together and rank the catalogs of UFO and Thin Lizzy, and that's another Phil as a frontman, and that's another guy who doesn't push a lot of air and who's got an odd frontman status. And they had even less success than Thin Lizzy, and a very parallel sort of career. Fair bit of success in the UK. They weirdly had kind of a big following in the Chicago area, but very parallel careers, and that's why we're putting them together. And they both had the big Bruce Springsteen, Van Morrison sort of vibe, part of that family. I did a whole History in 5 Songs with Mark Popoff podcast episode on that as well, where you bring in, this Bruce Springsteen or Van Morrison family, which includes the likes of Elvis Costello, Boomtown Rats, Graham Parker as well. But the two Phils have that in common as well, that storytelling thing. So yeah, interesting. These singers that you wonder, have they taken away 15% of their commerciality by not pushing a lot of air?
Yeah, it's almost like if you took your average Thin Lizzy track and broke it down to its individual vocals, guitars, bass. Mm-hmm. So you've got the music track going along, and it almost sometimes it seems like the vocal track, they took it and pushed it a little bit so that his phrasing doesn't come in where you expect it to. It doesn't come in on the one. Yeah. But yet, that's what people like about Thin Lizzy, and also what makes them so unique. I myself, growing up in the 80s, my first exposure to hearing about this band called Thin Lizzy, which I was like you, I'm like, that's kind of a weird name for a rock band, it doesn't particularly say anything about what kind of band you're expecting. But I think the first I heard of Thin Lizzy was when Phil died in January 86. And for some reason, we got much music in my hometown right early 86. So right around that time, they played Out in the Fields a lot. Gary Moore and Phil Lynott. They played that video a lot. It's the only time Gary Moore ever got much video play. And that was when I first heard of Thin Lizzy, and then I started reading rock magazines and hearing about, this band that so many people, from Bon Jovi to Def Leppard to, like I said, Rush, like everybody talked about Thin Lizzy in these sort of reverent tones,
Mhm.
but didn't often mention particular albums. So I mean, as a young person, I wouldn't have known where to start. And I remember hearing, I think I heard the Boys Are Back in Town and thinking that it, yeah, it does have that Springsteen Born to Run, like that storytelling, and that, that's somebody else. Like, he throws a lot of syllables in, but he does push more air. But yeah, not the type of band that I was likely to get into at that time, but they were always in the back of my mind as a band that I should check out someday. Although, having said that, probably if somebody had handed me it's so weird, Martin, because it's not like you could just go on YouTube and listen. You'd read about this stuff, you had no idea what it sounded like.
Yeah.
You didn't know anybody that owned any of the albums. But me being such a White Snake fan and, loving that first Blue Murder album, if somebody had handed me Thunder and Lightning, say, hey, John Sykes is on this, I might have liked that album. But of course, that's the 90125, right? Like, it doesn't really have anything to do with anything that came before it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fun. It's funny you mentioned like where to start sort of thing. And I've always said this about the Thin Lizzy catalog and the UFO catalog and the Van Halen catalog. It's, when you're trying to figure out like what is the greatest album and which one ranks highest, there's no consensus whatsoever.
All over the
And
place.
it's not even, and with Thin Lizzy is one of my favorite bands, but with UFO, for example, and even Van Halen, actually, it's not even that they're all tied because there's like 4 or 5 10 out of 10s. It's more like, as a deep fan, you find a lot to complain about every album, and you can't figure out which one's going to be first. Like with UFO and Van Halen, I'm feeling like there's a tie at the top, but they're all 8s kind of thing.
Yeah.
Thin Lizzy, even with Thin Lizzy, I can, even though they are one of my very favorite bands, I can think of always 1 or 2 songs which are complete throwaways. Not complete on everyone, but well, pretty near, where there's one or at least one song which I have no love for whatsoever on the album. So at that point, you're supposed to, your brain is supposed to say, well, there are 10 songs and I only like 9, so it is a 9 out of 10, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of do that math. So it is funny, but yeah, with Thin Lizzy, man, you get basically every single album mentioned. You don't. I pick Renegade as my favorite Thin Lizzy album. That's a really contrarian choice. Some people will pick Thunder and Lightning, but generally speaking, you will hear Fighting, you will hear Jailbreak, Johnny the Fox, Bad Reputation, and Black Rose. I'm hearing Black Rose a lot.
75 to 80. That's about the only thing that's in
Yeah.
that they have in common.
Chinatown is,
we get the early
there's
period.
one more, but Chinatown in 80, and you don't hear that one particularly much, but you do hear that run from Fighting, all in a row, right up to Black Rose all the time, right?
Yeah, and some might even pick Live and Dangerous.
Yeah, you get that a lot too, and then that's when you want to put the guy in a headlock and say you're not supposed to include live albums, right? Because we always
Kiss
have
Alive
that, right?
Is your favorite. It's like, it's cheating.
I think that's become a standard of ranking now, that people now realize and recognize you don't include live albums. But it's funny, with so many of these bands, that happens a lot, where people say, oh, the greatest Judas Priest album is Unleashed in the East, right? Kind of thing, right? And yeah, I mean, you're picking these, but I've always said that live albums are just greatest hits albums, so it's unfair.
Well,
they're heavier, so it's unfair for that reason, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that make it unfair. Like, especially if you're talking about the 70s, yes, the songs probably do sound better because of the productions of the time. And Thin Lizzy's productions also tended to be all over the place sonically. They never really had a very beefy sound, and except Thunder and Lightning, which is almost an overcorrection, right?
Yeah.
Like, that album doesn't sound like Chris Tsangarides' production at all. It sounds more like I don't know, Neil Kernon or the really, really amplified drums that don't even sound I'm gonna say don't even sound real, but they certainly don't sound like Brian Downey. Like never heard an Ian Pace album, like if Ian Pace played on, where the drums are that thick, because
Yeah.
he's too nimble a drummer, and Brian Downey's like that too. Brian Downey's like the secret star of Thin Lizzy. I mean,
Yeah.
his drum patterns can elevate an otherwise boring song, and they can take a good song and make them even better.
Yeah.
I'm guessing most people would never go for like the first three or four Thin Lizzy albums, although there might be
No.
some.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I never really hear those, because the first two are like a set. The third one is pretty loud and fairly heavy, but raw. So that's still the Eric Bell era. And then the next one is a bit of an anomaly because it is so kind of R&B and mellow and dialed back. And the production on that, Ron Nevison production on that one, is very toppy. So it doesn't have a lot of bottom end. And I've always felt that way about Jailbreak as well. Whereas Fighting has a lot of bottom end and not a lot of top end. But it's actually a really well produced album for 75, ironically produced by Phil Lynott. And then Johnny the Fox to me sounds like Fighting in terms of the production. And I think they get a pretty darn good. Well, actually, so Bad Reputation also feels a little toppy, bright. And then I think Black Rose sounds good. Chinatown sounds good, although people say it's a little raw. And then I really like Renegade's sound as well. But yeah, Chris Tangerides, that's, it's funny. I've been, reading your book, and then that's covered off well enough in here, because I think Chris gets his very best sounds on the YT stuff as well, right? And but yeah, it's good to hear you're continuing on with this sort of thing. You've got other bands in mind, and you're in the middle. I know we don't want to talk about who you're.
Yeah, I'm heavily trying to get as of filming this, I'm trying to wrap one up and get another one out sometime this year. Thank you for that too. Yeah. Mean Streak is an incredible sounding album, and it's funny because it doesn't sound anything like Thunder and Lightning, and yet same producer, same year, like exact same year. Thin Lizzy's production, productions are something else that can turn people on. It's funny, like I think we've gone through this when someone says, "Hey, where do I start with such and such a band?" And as a fan, you don't want to be the fanboy that says, "It doesn't matter, it's all great." You really want someone to like something, so you start going through the albums. You go, "Yeah, I would say this one. It's got this. Oh yeah, but then it's got that one. I don't like that one." They go to the next one. Yeah, that's got this, but oh yeah, there aren't as many good. It's you're really tough on yourself as a fan, saying, I got to nail this, right? Because I would hate for someone to just kind of blindly go in, like say if somebody was interested in checking out Deep Purple, and the first thing they hear is one of those myriad compilations of the Mark I stuff, and listen to it, go, "Oh, this is terrible." Or Alice Cooper, like how many different versions of that the Toronto 1969, that unlistenable performing like Nobody Likes Me and all that stuff. I hate for somebody to listen to that and go, I'm never checking anything out by him again. So with Thin Lizzy, you want to be careful. You don't want to say, and I like starting people off with an actual album, not necessarily a comp. And that's the other thing. I don't think that Thin Lizzy have a definitive comp either. I don't think there's a definitive like one disc greatest hits. So like this will get you started. I think the 2004 greatest hits is kind of has some value to it, because it also has, like I said, it's got out in the Fields. It's got some stuff from Phil's solo albums like King's Call, and I get such a kick out of Black Pearl. That's such a strange song, and the video's funny to me. Every once in a while, if I need a laugh, I'll watch that video for Black Pearl. But yeah, to start someone out on Thin Lizzy, I'd say, well, just know that there's probably going to be 2 or 3 songs you really like, and the rest of them you might scratch your head a little bit, but stick with it. Because it does bear results, and they become a band that I feel like I learned something. And I don't know if it's Phil's lyrics or his delivery, but he feels like sort of the wise old man cautioning, the cautionary tale on, don't overdo it. Don't do, and yet he's always happy. He's got no problem getting into a fight, and you're right. There's a lot of that in the book that comes up, like the continuing things, like we got to get out of this town, or we got to leave this town. And it, for a band that's, so very Irish in their delivery, there's a lot of like American Wild West imagery, a lot of cowboy imagery. But yet when Phil gets traditional Irish, very traditional Irish, like Black Rose, the song Black Rose. Um, it's yeah, it's not an easy sell.
It's funny, you got me. The wheels are turning. I'm going like, what is the most dyed in the wool standard mean median average Thin Lizzy album? And two come to mind. Um, Johnny the Fox and Chinatown in a weird way. So Chinatown is always somewhat, there's always a little bit of passive aggressive complaint about Chinatown that it's almost too many of all the Thin Lizzy tricks of the trade put on one album sort of thing. That
almost
they
feels like
are,
a checklist.
yeah, checklist, spinning their wheels. As I've put it over the years, this feels like an album that didn't really need to happen. It's like it was just on the schedule. We have to come up
We
with
got to get an album out
material,
in 1980.
put an album out.
Yeah.
And then, but Johnny the Fox weirdly feels like, even though there's no big massive hits on it, you almost feel like the experiments are not too experimental, and there's the right amount of balladry, and the production is sober and conservative and good essentially. And the rockers are there. It's almost like it just feels like it's the most unified, all of them. But then you get the echoes of that again. Skip a couple and get up to Chinatown. And the funny thing about Chinatown is that you play those songs. And I've often been of the opinion that I could play those songs and say, okay, so yeah, I guess I'm hearing the Thin Lizzy tricks of the trade, but this is like the best version of this. And I could pick songs off of that record and say these are close to my favorite Thin Lizzy songs. But I just want to mention one other thing. Like again, it just blows my mind, this concept of not being able to pick a favorite album. And the worst band for that, I swear, has got to be Van Halen, because I just see I like am always at a loss for words. My favorite Van Halen album today is 1984, and I never would have said that back in the old days, right? People say there's something about Fair Warning, there's something about Women and Children First. Oh no, the first one's obviously the absolutely objectively best put together one, and that's probably true. But I've seen people say two. Then there's the Sammy Hagar fans who are going to pick usually 5150. So it's crazy trying to figure out.
Mine's for unlawful carnal knowledge.
Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah. All over the place.
Yeah. You never hear Diver Down, essentially. You don't really hear OU 812 too often, or Balance, right? Or the last one. But yeah, it's so funny when people pick Fair Warning or Women and Children First, which I've tended to do as well. And then you start pulling apart the album and you going, this song's stupid, this song's stupid, this song's stupid. And all of a sudden, half the album you're complaining about, right?
Yeah. This is so supposed to be your favorite. Yeah.
Yeah.
You brought up a good, you reminded me of something with Johnny the Fox. And it's surprising that album is as good as it is, because, and again, it's a coincidence it being 1976. It's a little bit like Led Zeppelin's Presence, in that it's an album that they probably weren't planning on doing an album when they did it. And in Zeppelin's case, it's because Robert Plant had his accident. And then in Thin Lizzy's case, he got sick. And it's like, well, we might as well do an album. So it's maybe it speaks to just, the professionalism. They came up with this great album, this Johnny the Fox, when, if the cards had been dealt a different way, they'd just still been on the road supporting Jailbreak. So it's really interesting to think about how that was almost an album that wasn't meant to be.
Yeah, Phil's writing it from his hospital bed. They get 2 albums out in 1976, and you hear that about Brian May as well, writing songs and from the hospital bed or whatever.
That was what Sheer Heart, during making Sheer Heart Attack, and again, I think it was Sheer Heart Attack, wasn't it? He was,
I believe so, yeah.
And yet they still got 2 albums out in 74. That didn't slow their momentum at all.
Yeah,
I have to think that a lot of it goes back to, and I talked about this with Y&T too, they didn't have high-powered management. They could have stayed in the UK and still made more of an impact. It certainly didn't hurt Queen, because Queen never, they never relocated to North America. It didn't hurt them. Of course, Queen had singles that were so very commercial, right? Even though they were daring and thoughtful, and, especially in the 70s. But certainly if Thin Lizzy had done like a Fog Hat,
Mhm.
and moved to where they moved, New York, or
Yeah.
um, maybe it
Queen
might have
is an
been.
interesting one because I did a podcast episode on this as well. Queen is an interesting one because their hits are almost all novelty songs, right?
They're
So
very unique in
you've
and of
got Killer
themselves.
Queen, you got We Are the Champions,
Yeah,
which with that weird sort of hook line idea. You've got We Will Rock You, which is very novelty. Bohemian Rhapsody, total novelty. Tie Your Mother Down with that strange title, although the rest of the song isn't particularly novelty. You've got Crazy Little Thing Called Love,
yeah,
Radio Gaga.
yeah. Another one bites the
Another one bites the
Under
dust.
Pressure. Yeah,
Yeah, so they did a lot of amusing songs as singles.
that just happened to get picked as singles. Where
Yeah,
I don't know, like Thin Lizzy don't really. I'm trying to. I mean, well, when they try to do, sounds like when they tried to do something like that, it failed miserably. Like I only just recently got Black Rose and listened to that, and I think that's quite a good album. But that S&M song, that's horrible.
yeah,
The ouch, like that's that
yeah,
is that's ill advised. So it didn't really work. Like Queen did things that I think any other band that had been laughed, all the way back to London. Um,
mhm,
but Thin Lizzy, there was a certain sense of humor, but at the same time, I don't think it wasn't at the Queen level. That's like Queen could have put out a single like Dancing in the Moonlight, and it could have been a worldwide hit, and
mhm.
radio stations that never played them before or since would have played that song in heavy rotation. It could have been that song where people go,
Yeah,
"Oh, they're that band that does Dancing in the Moonlight." Are all their songs like that? Well, no,
yeah.
but with Thin Lizzy, it just comes up. I remember seeing the video to that on Much Music on Backtracks and going, I thought they were supposed to be heavy, and then they got this like R&B type song.
Yeah, yeah,
Very strange.
yeah, and Black Rose is such a funny one too, where you think of so yeah, again, S&M, nobody likes that song. I don't like the song Sarah or My Sarah, whatever you want to call it. It goes by both titles, but and then they had another Sarah as well. But it's that you think of Waiting for an Alibi, Do Anything You Want to Do, Toughest Street in Town. So they even when they wrote fairly heavy songs, they were hooky. But yeah, I suppose there's a certain darkness there. There's a certain introspection. They particularly didn't write novelty songs, so that as well. And then yeah, there's just really it almost feels like a band where there's like 5 songs per album that are potential singles, but they're only 75% of the way there to being a single, right? They're like
Yeah,
so promising and so close and so strong, but they're not quite, just unanimously everybody's going to jump up and down saying that's a single.
I'm thinking like in terms of the UK charts, I'm hearing songs that I could hear that being a top 20 song or like a number
Yeah.
25 or number 28.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing top tens, except maybe the boys are back in town.
Yeah.
And that's not a
Yeah.
bad thing. I mean, that
Yeah.
those are bands that sometimes have a long career that have a lot of those mid-chart hits. But yeah, interesting band, and definitely a catalog I'm looking forward to exploring further. And yeah, you've got quite a panel of experts on here. I mean, Peter Jones, John the Music Nut. I mean, Sean Kelly. I mean, some of these guys I've utilized them within the pages of my books too. And there are a lot. Yeah, Reed. I mean, I don't want to leave anybody out, but yeah, everybody that contributes to this sort of steps up to it. And I like the fact that we're all coming at it from a different perspective as far as like getting into a band with a certain album, whereas I got into sort of like way after the fact and all at once. Also, I like the fact that you did put an 8-track in there. That's
Yeah,
always
yeah,
fun to
we've
see.
got the
Yeah,
color section as well in here.
yeah,
It's a good substantial. It's 286 pages. I mean,
yeah.
it's a good substantial. Again, it's just a bunch of people getting together and really breaking down these albums and what makes them good, and it really does serve a completely different purpose than a standard biography, and I found it quite rewarding. But yeah, and I what I hear time and time again with these books, these panel books, is that people will read it while playing the catalog. They're constantly going back. And what did this guy point out? That's crazy. I got to go hear that.
Yeah.
They stop reading and they go over to the record and go, wow, I did not hear that tambourine track in the left channel or whatever.
And right? I want to dig in further. I'm in the book and I want to dig in further. And that's one of the things I like about the format too, because it really lays it out for you. This is what they have. These are the albums. Yeah. You can go get a compilation or one of the live albums if you want, but these are the studio albums. This is when they went in with a vision to spit out however many songs. And this is, the creative work here, like my Y&T book, and the one I'm working on. The studio albums are what you want to concentrate on, because you wouldn't have live albums compilations if there weren't songs to, fill out these albums and put them on. So
I like what you did also in this with the extensive discography at the end. And number one, it's the only Y&T book there is, so that's amazing as well. But you've got all the side projects and everything in here. It's really cool what you've done with this. And
that was one of the hardest parts of that book, Martin, was all of the guest appearances, because I had no idea, for example, how many albums Steph Burns played on, or Jimmy DeGrasso. Right. I mean, Steph Burns is almost like a junior Steve Lukather. I mean, he was on everybody's albums that you just don't hear about it. And these guys, this is an interesting thing too. And I don't know what made me think of that, but it's the whole idea of when you talked about Snowy White, like, am I working on a Thin Lizzy song, or is this going to be on one of Phil's albums? Yeah. Kind of working on a band album and a solo album simultaneously, like that, to me, that's a recipe for confusion all around.
Yeah. And it's funny when Pete and I do this next episode of Sea of Tranquility, I just hit him up with the idea. Hey, you know what? Because we're doing UFO to the end of Thin Lizzy, why not throw in those 2 studio albums? And we threw in the first 4 Michael Schenker Group albums, because we're going right to the end of '83 on it. But man, those two Phil Lynotts, I just love them to death as well. I just think, and obviously they are smartly and deftly done in that, generally speaking, it's almost like here's the Thin Lizzy wide spectrum of what they do. We could take those 2 Phil albums and they'll overlap a little bit with what Thin Lizzy does, but they definitely have much more going on that you couldn't put into Thin Lizzy things. So both at the same time, they feel part of the Thin Lizzy catalog, but they're more like the nightlife of the Thin Lizzy catalog.
And the fact that he only did 2, it makes it an awful lot easier to say, well, we might as well talk about these 2. It's almost like if you're going to, do Aerosmith, well, you might as well do the 3 Joe Perry Project albums and the Whitford St. Home, because there just wasn't a lot of extra stuff. It's not like, you'd never want to do Led Zeppelin and do all of Robert Plant, because he had a bigger solo career, and that's another book that you just did. We just talked about recently. But with Thin Lizzy, there's overlap, right? As far as personnel. So it kind of becomes like, almost, when is it not a Thin Lizzy album? Is it just the name on the cover? It's like when David Coverdale did that Into the Light album. He put it out under his own name, and now, if I understand this correctly, he's reissuing it as a Whitesnake album. Mm-hmm. And so if you're like me, you go, well, now I got to buy it. It's one of those weird things. So honesty, not innocence, but honesty is no excuse. Thin Lizzy on record, album by album, basically, is the format. And a lot of great points brought up. This is what you want. If you keep hearing about this band Thin Lizzy, if you really want to dig in further, this is a good place to start. And like Martin said, with the music, not far away, so you can refer. When they talk about this place at 225, when he says this, well, okay, and you go and listen to it. So highly recommended. MartinPopoff.com. That's where you get all of Martin's books. He will sign them to you when you order them. And so I guess you've always got irons in the fire. What's the latest? What are you working on?
Well, you've contributed again to a Rainbow book coming this way as well, and I'm working on 2 Genesis ones at once as well. So definitely got those happening. And we got Van Halen at 50 coming shortly. The wacky, crazy occult conspiracy theory, Blue Oyster Cult, Imaginos related books are doing well. So the old one was called Flaming Telepaths. Imaginos expanded and specified. The new one is called Perfect Water, The Rebel Imaginos. And that's the coolest book I've ever done. It's crazy, nutty, super in depth, long. I did illustrations for it and all that. So yeah, all of this is at martinpopoff.com. Every week I've got the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and we've got the YouTube channel, which you've been a part of in a lot of episodes, The Contrarians.
Yes, and don't forget, I've been really enjoying the Wednesday night album discussions, whether it's album covers with makeup. And I actually, to be quite honest with you, when I watched the album covers with makeup, that gave me an idea for a show that I could do down the road. Nice. But anyway, so yeah. So if you're curious about Thin Lizzy, and it's not just about getting a CD and listening to it or getting a record, you want to read more about the nuts and bolts and what people think of them. Honesty is no excuse. Thin Lizzy on record. Check it out at martinpopoff.com. Martin, thanks for taking a little time out. Thank you again for your support of the Y&T book. Really appreciate it. That's still available, but I'll have that stuff posted. And we will see you all later. Thanks for watching this edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions.